Welcome back. I'm developer evangelist Kevin Hoyt. In this series, we've been talking about web standards. Now I'd like to focus on WebSocket. Now the WebSocket API allows you to open a connection from the browser to a server and keep that connection persistent. And then as you want to send data either from the client or from the server out to the client, or any number of clients participating in that conversation, as it were, that's what WebSocket allows you to do. And it happens all pretty much in real time. The other cool thing about the WebSocket technology is it can be used for all kinds of really interesting data coming from really interesting places. So kind of the traditional example would be a financial world where you get stock data that's being pushed to you in near real time, so that you want to make a trade based on current pricing. You can do that as close to the actual price as possible. Another example might be a chat. If you want to build a chat between your customer service representatives and the people who are using your product, the WebSocket technology is a great candidate to look at. Now, the WebSocket API is still a little in flux, as with most emerging web standards. And in this case, you'll find that some browsers implement the HXC76 protocol. HXC76 is some of the early kind of workings around WebSockets in terms of how the data is passed back and forth, and indeed actually how the handshake happens between the client and the server as they go to make that initial connection. That was some of the early work, and there was a lot of emphasis on the handshake for security purposes. That over time evolved into what I refer to as HiBi, or HiBi 17, and I think there's actually another one or two of that 17, so 18, 19 being relative to the versions at this point. That kind of came along and said, well, let's de-emphasize a little bit of the security of the handshake and put more emphasis on the security and the transmission of the messages themselves. So a couple different perspectives, and over time the HiBi 17 won out, and it's actually now RFC 6455, and so that specification is coming closer and closer to becoming a reality for us to use. But just know that there are two different versions out there that have different emphases, on how the handshake is made and what data is sent back and forth. Generally speaking, I think until about a week ago, or maybe even this week as of this recording, Safari on the desktop was using the older HXC76 specification. Now, in practice, most WebSocket servers out there already handle both those variations easily, and they can tell because of how the request is being made and how the handshake is being requested. And they go ahead and deal with that and automate that process for you. So generally speaking, you probably won't ever have to worry about it. But in case you run across a case where you're trying some of this stuff out and it doesn't work, you might think that you might want to think about what version of the browser you're using and what version of the protocol that it might be using behind the scenes. If you want to know for sure, you can go to websocketstest.com, which is a great place to see all the different kinds of real-time capabilities of your specific browser. And if you're looking for just kind of a place to kind of echo and a message and ping a message off of and get something back as a test without having to set up your own server, you can go to ws://echo-websocket.org. That is a URL that we'll be using in our demonstration momentarily. Now, the WebSocket is actually a class. It's just like you might say new string or new number, you say new WebSocket. And on that WebSocket class, you have a few different events that you can partake in. The first one is on open. That is the connection from that socket to the server has been established, so we have an open state. We have a situation where we might be getting a message from the server. You gotta remember that persistent connection. That's going to be an on message event. When we've decided to terminate the connection to the server, whether that be on our behalf or the server's behalf, that is called an on-close event. And then finally, when we want to actually send messages from the client, we call a method called send and pass it some data, and that'll go along the wire. Something else to know about WebSockets is that it's one of the first places where I started to encounter the capability for the web to handle binary data in addition to the kind of traditional text data that we normally deal with. That's a pretty exciting new avenue for us to explore. It opens up the door for some really interesting applications. So let's see WebSockets in action here. I'm going to go over to Dreamweaver here, where I've got an Echo HTML page loaded up. Now, Echo HTML is going to essentially let us use that Echo server just as an example to send some data and get that data back, just so we can get our heads around the different techniques used here in WebSockets. The application itself is not particularly complex. There's a form here, and the form is going to be located at the bottom of our screen. It's positioned via CSS and stylized a bit, but essentially lets us send a message off to that server. And then we're going to be echoing, and since we're echoing, I figured that what better place to echo than the Grand Canyon, so you can holler off into the Grand Canyon and get an echo back. This div element will have the Grand Canyon in it, and as our messages come back from the server, they'll be placed into that scene randomly, just as though we were getting an echo back off of the canyon walls. So that's all for the HTML. Again, not very complex. As we get into the JavaScript behind this guy, let's come up to the top here. I've got a few uppercase variables, or variables with uppercase names, so I treat as constants. The main one that we're going to be interested in here is the echo server, which, as you recall earlier, I said is ws:// echo websocket.org. Now again, WebSocket can handle both text and binary. So in this case, the server says what encoding that you prefer to be using. And in this case, we're going to be using an encoding of text, just to send the text messages from our terminal off to the server and get something back. We have a reference to the WebSocket itself that we'll use. And when the document gets loaded, we'll go ahead, take that socket variable and create a new instance of WebSocket connecting out to that echo server. From there, we'll register the events for onOpen. That is, again, we've connected to the server. OnMessage, that is that we've gotten a message back from the server. And then onClose, then we've actually finished connecting to the server or done with that particular conversation. In this case, the only reason onClose would actually be called because there's no UI to close the connection for ourselves. The only time that connection would be closed would be if the server decided to terminate it. And in the case of persistent connections, that's something you have to keep in mind. You might be connecting off to a server via your hotspot on your mobile phone, and your mobile phone decides that it wants to do something else, and you lose connection. You need to be aware of that and handle that in your application. So in this case, on Open, I'm going to go ahead and just change the UI a little bit. I'm going to take that canyon and move it a little bit up so that I can reveal the place for us to holler into the Grand Canyon, our little form. At that point, we'll have a send button, and when we click on the send button, we're going to go ahead and call some elements to change up the UI a bit, but mostly is this socket.send. So we're going to actually send that data that's in the form off to the WebSocket server, and then it'll go off and it'll come back to us, and we'll put it in the screen. That'll be an onMessage. So let's go ahead and move up to the onMessage. Now in this case, there's a bunch of kind of styling and CSS transition work that I'm doing to show the bubble that is the text message that comes back from the server, and then to fade it off over time. I'm not going to cover all of that CSS transition information in this particular session, so I've abstracted that a little bit. We'll call a method called balloon, which just puts that little word bubble up in the screen and then handles the fading off for us in the background. But you'll notice I'm passing the event.data. Event.data is the property. That data property is the messages come back to us from the server, and in this case, it's exactly what we sent to the server. So that goes up on the screen and eventually it fades out, and we can continue to do that so long as we're connected to the server. And at some point the server might come back and say, you know what, we're done. The server's going down for whatever reason. So in this case, we'll come up here to the do close. And again, I'm just going to take that Grand Canyon scene and move it down a little bit so that it covers up our form so we can no longer send any more messages in case we have that connection closed. So that's all it is for working with the WebSocket. It's pretty straightforward API, actually. Let's go over here to the browser. I'm just going to refresh to make sure I have a nice clean connection. You'll actually see the scene as we've connected actually kind of slide up. You'll see it reveal the form where we can put our information. Let's go ahead and say hello world, and then send that off into the server. It goes off to the server, comes back, and appears right on our screen here as that little bubble, and then over time fades away. Now, if you want to do something more along the lines of financial data, you might be interested in getting data pushed to you as it is generated. I have another example. I won't cover all the details in this particular example, but we have here a little panel, and it has an open connection and a start feed button. If I click the open connection, we're actually going to open a connection to the WebSocket server. Now in this case, the WebSocket server, believe it or not, is actually written in JavaScript and is running on Adobe Air, which is kind of an interesting implementation detail onto its own. But in this case, we've connected out to that WebSocket server, and the WebSocket server is now ready to start sending off random numbers. We'll go ahead and say start the feed, and it will start kicking off those random numbers. And at this point, we can actually take this guy, I'm going to shrink it up a little bit, bring up a new window, take that URL, paste it into the new window, go ahead and open the connection on this side of the fence, start listening for that data, and you'll actually notice that both windows are getting the same pieces of data simultaneously because they both have connections, persistent connections, open to that server. At any point in time, I can stop the feed, the other one keeps going. In this case, this particular window is no longer listening. I can go ahead and restart and join that conversation and get the data. And so that might be something you might see in a more traditional financial world and financial application that might be useful with WebSocket. Let me go ahead and stop the feed, close the connection, and we'll just let that guy run as we close out the session. So that's WebSocket. It's actually not particularly complex. A few different methods: on open, on message, on close, and then when you want to send something, just call that send method. And then from there, your imagination can take you the rest of the way. There's more to come in this series. Until then, I'll be waiting.